Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for joining us for NHC's Restoring Neighborhoods Task Force meeting. This is our December 6th meeting, clearly. And we're going to be talking about community land trusts today. My name is Rebecca King. I'm a policy director here at the National Housing Conference, and I'm joined by Caitlin Snyder, our policy and research associate. Before we dive into our wonderful speakers and their presentations, we're going to run through a couple of policy updates and some upcoming research from NHC. I do want to take a quick second just to remind you, as you listen to the presentations and the materials, please feel free to send questions through the chat box. And if you run into any technical issues with GoToWebinar, there's a help menu and support.citrix online for any of those challenges. So with that, I'm going to dive into some policy updates. In case you missed it, I'm hoping you didn't, but in case you missed it, over the weekend, the Senate passed its version of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act by a vote of 51 to 49. So the Senate version of this tax reform bill retains the low-income housing tax credit. It also retains private activity bonds, including multifamily housing bonds and the new markets tax credit through 2019. The bill also makes modifications that would directly and indirectly impact the low-income housing tax credit. So the House and the Senate are supposed to begin conference negotiations this week to resolve differences between the bills. The House has announced their conferees. The Senate has not yet voted to go to conference or announced their conferees, at least last I checked. Highlighting this for you because even though now there's a House bill and a Senate bill, conference negotiations are really important. The bills are really different when it comes to affordable housing. The House bill eliminated multifamily housing bonds and new markets tax credits. So that threat to affordable housing production, which is significant, is still on the table. So we need to continue reaching out, especially to Republican offices in the House, about the importance of multifamily bonds. Just as a reminder for you, in case you missed this, which you might have, NHC has state fact sheets on our website to show how every state uses private activity bonds for housing, both single family and multifamily. And the Action Campaign has a great advocacy toolkit. So we will include links to all of that in the follow-up email. But just want to raise that for you to continue to stay engaged. The other big policy update today is around appropriations. So the current continuing resolution expires Friday. That's right, Friday. And we do not yet have agreement or legislation to extend federal spending. The House did introduce, I should say House Republicans introduced legislation over the weekend that would extend through December 22nd. The Freedom Caucus in the House is raising some objections and also pushing for a December 30th extension. Congressional leadership, Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi in the House, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell in the Senate, Speaker Ryan, and Schumer in the Senate are meeting with President Trump tomorrow to discuss federal spending. So we'll see where that goes. As I said, there's still not an agreement to lift the spending caps required by the Budget Control Act. So a lot of uncertainty still around appropriations. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has pledged the government will not shut down. But earlier today, President Trump said that it might. So apparently even a government shutdown is still on the table, which I didn't really think was. So really be following appropriations really closely, as we will be. And just as a reminder, if that wasn't enough, the National Flood Insurance Program also expires December 8th. So hopefully when they address federal spending, they will also at least give us a short-term extension on flood insurance so we can make some reforms. But that is appropriations. I'm not going to go into great detail on the next item because there's just too much. But I did want to make sure everyone had seen that the Federal Housing Finance Agency has been putting out a number of announcements and updates in recent weeks. Evaluation guidance for duty to serve, so how Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are going to be measured on how they're doing with their plans. So it's important to check that out. They've issued an update on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's credit risk transfer programs, as well as an update on the Single Security Initiative and the Common Securitization Platform. Additionally, they've announced maximum conforming loan limits for 2018 and the 2018 multifamily lending caps. And they did make a couple of changes around the caps, so I would check that out, and we will, again, include all the links in the follow-up email. The last thing I wanted to touch on is NHC's Nexus Policy Guide. This is on the policy tab of our website, and we have sections on funding tools and inclusive communities now available. So this new section on inclusive communities includes helpful information on inclusionary housing, land-based solutions, shared equity homeownership, rental preservation, and voucher mobility. It's a really great resource, so we wanted to highlight it for you. And we will be adding the next section on regulatory strategies in the coming weeks. So be on the lookout for that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin. And again, as I said, please feel free to send questions as we go.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. So today I'm going to talk about NHC's new publication, Using Land to Restore Neighborhoods and Build Community. And this report that we're releasing really profiles community land trusts, and it provides a basic overview of what they are and how they've been used, and then dives into 4 program examples to give you more specifics. So I want to start with just kind of the basics. So a community land trust is a nonprofit corporation that develops and stewards affordable housing, community gardens, civic buildings, commercial spaces, and other community assets on behalf of a community. And if that sounds like a mouthful of a definition, that's because it is, and it's really hard to pin down one solid definition because community land trusts are so different across the country, and they really reflect what the community's needs are. So most commonly, CLTs are implemented as a platform for affordable housing, but like I said, they can be used for a variety of things. One of the more common things outside of affordable housing that we've seen is for community agriculture, commercial space for small businesses, or if a community has vacant land or vacant properties, they might just take over that space and have people in charge of it so that it's they have some control over the land. So for CLTs and affordable housing, I wanted to mention that they work for both homeownership and rental opportunities. And I wanted to touch specifically on the foreclosure crisis and how CLTs were used during the foreclosure crisis. So during the crisis, homes on community land trusts outperformed the market in both delinquency rates and foreclosure rates. So we saw that in 2009, 1.6% of loans on houses on CLT land were seriously delinquent, and that's 90 days or more overdue, compared to 7% of prime loans and 30% of subprime loans. And I want to repeat that because it's 1.6% compared to 7% and 30%. So we're not just talking about little margins here. We're talking about really a community is being able to stay in their homes and having a vastly different experience of the foreclosure crisis. So that was delinquency, and then for foreclosures, CLT homes, it was 0.6% compared to 3.3% for prime and 15.6% for subprime, and that was all in the year of 2009. So currently, we know of over 300 community land trusts throughout the country, and our brief profiles 4 of them. So we profile Champlain Housing Trust in Vermont, the City of Lakes Community Land Trust in Minnesota, who will be presenting later on this webinar, the Trust South LA Community Land Trust in California, and the Oakland Community Land Trust in California. And these profiles are really great. They provide a lot of insight into the different types of CLTs throughout the country. None of them are exactly the same, and that was intentional. We wanted to give folks a variety of the different work that CLTs can do. So I think you'll hear that in today's webinar, and you'll see that in the brief. And we really hope that these profiles can help readers understand how CLTs started, what you might need to do to start a CLT in your community, and also see how they evolved over time as the community's needs changed and they responded to meet those needs. So with there, I'll pause and turn it over to our presenters.
Great, thanks, Caitlin. So give us 1 second to get everybody teed up. We are going to start with Stacy Horwitz, who's the operations director for the City of Lakes Community Land Trust. As Caitlin mentioned, they are highlighted in our brief. And just a quick side note, our brief is coming out next week. So we will share that with all of you next week. But I'm going to turn it over to Stacy.
Hello, everyone. This is Stacy Horwitz with the City of Lakes Community Land Trust. Our mission at the City of Lakes Community Land Trust is to create community ownership that preserves affordability and inclusivity. And just wanted to share a little bit of information about our organization and some data just to get a sense of who we serve and where we're sitting as far as our work within the City of Minneapolis. So our geographic service area is the City of Minneapolis. There are 4 other community land trusts in the Twin Cities metro area that serve other surrounding suburbs as well as the City of St. Paul and some of the far east and far southwest areas of the Twin Cities. At the end of this year, we will have 250 homes in the City of Lakes Community Land Trust. We started in 2002 and sold our first home in 2004. So over the last 13 years, we've grown into the 250 homes. And we also had 50 additional resales. So we are closing in on serving close to 300 households through the City of Lakes Community Land Trust. Within our portfolio, we have a number of different types of housing. We have single-family homes, multi-generational single-family homes, which are homes that are a 3-bedroom, 1.5 bath kind of main section of the house with an accessory dwelling unit attached. And we built those new starting in 2014 and have 2 more in progress. It's just our city took a while to adopt a citywide accessory dwelling unit policy throughout. And so we now are being able to build more of the type of housing that we refer to as multi-generational, because the design came from community requests and comments for a different type of housing where there could either be a caretaking situation, either for an elderly parent, multiple generations in one house, or a situation where there may be a child who is grown but still needing to have full-time care. We also are doing owner-occupied duplexes, townhomes, condominiums, and we have a very, very, very small rental portfolio in 4 units that are just to the east of our office space. Majority of our homeowners are first-time home buyers and homeowners, and our average affordability investment into a home is just shy of about $50,000. Our average household income is 51% AMI, and for our region, for a household of between 2 and 3 people, that's about $37,000, just a bit over $37,000. Within our homeowners, 54% are single female head of household, and 53% are communities of color household. I wanted to share this slide. It was something that the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota put together to just show the different in home values. So I wanted to give you a sense of what our market has looked like over time since about 1996 up through 2017. And if you see, Minneapolis is the purple line, and you can see the increase just prior to the down market, and then the dip and the fact that we are back on the incline. This was important to share because our housing market has changed significantly in the last 12 to 18 months. And while we're not quite near where some of our other colleagues are around the country, part of our conversation here locally is about making sure that we're building an affordability, that as things continue to increase in decline, that we're capturing an opportunity at this particular time in the city to create long-term affordability. And so just wanted to demonstrate that our market continues to increase. So one of the things we were asked to share today is just some of the key initiatives our organization has done over time. And one of the things in helping to understand what we've done is when we started, we did not start out as a developer. It is very common for community land trust to start out owning land and then developing, usually housing for the most part, on that land. However, when this initiative was started in the city of Minneapolis, there was a significant number of developers in the community, and we opted to start more in a developer partnership. So our townhomes, our condominiums, all came through developer partnerships, where we came in with affordability assistance, but we had either a private developer or another nonprofit developer that actually built the structures. The other thing that we started in 2006 was a home buyer initiated program. That is by far, continues to be our most popular program. Of the 250 homes that we have in the City of Lakes Community Land Trust, about 50% of those have come through the buyer initiated program. And this is a program where individuals and families can go out and look for a home of their choice within the city of Minneapolis. Before they go out to look, we do meet with them in a realtor of their choice. They have an understanding of the maximum purchase amount they can offer. And then we do an inspection once the purchase agreement is executed and accept the home into the land trust. At time of closing, we take title to the land just as if we had developed it, and our homeowners have title to any buildings or structures that are on that land. And then we also do, when funding permits, which has been for the bulk of the homes purchased through the buyer initiated program, we also go in with some rehab assistance to address deferred maintenance, environmental remediation such as lead and asbestos, as well as much energy efficiency work that we can do and have budget for. About 3 years ago, we started with duplexes, and this again was in response to inquiries by community members and buyers coming through. In many cases, it was cultural-based requests for multi-generational living, and duplexes seem to be an avenue into creating that type of housing scenario for some of our families. And so we have developed a policy around doing owner-occupied duplexes, where our buyers will own and occupy long-term one of the units within the duplex, and then they will also operate as the landlord for that second unit. And we do require landlord training with that, as well as working to build a reserve fund for the owner of that duplex. I've touched a little bit on the multi-generational homes, and this again is a situation where there's an accessory dwelling unit attached to the home. Within the city of Minneapolis, there is the option to also build in a garage scenario, the ADU, or a separate structure on the property. In our first two homes, these were actually a 500 square foot ADU that was attached to the single family home that shared both a laundry space and then could also share the dining room if desired, or just create a self-contained unit that had a no-step entrance. And it was a single bedroom, single bath with a kitchenette and a living space. One of the things that continues to grow in our area, and in particular for the land trust, is tax forfeiture and foreclosure recapture. We have done about 6 or 7 homes in relation to this, and this is a situation primarily with the tax forfeiture where we have longtime residents, often elderly, or there's been a significant life issue that has resulted in that particular household going into tax forfeiture. The individual or family owns the home, and oftentimes it is free of any other liens, but the forfeiture amount can be somewhat substantial. But for an opportunity to pay off that lien or that delinquency, they would end up being most likely evicted from the home. So we have just now done our 6th home under the tax forfeiture, where we have essentially, if the amount that is owed is similar to what we would normally invest in a new buyer, is go in and satisfy that tax lien, the homeowner agrees for the home to become part of the land trust by quitclaiming the land to the land trust, and then we also address deferred maintenance in the home. We also want to make sure that they continue to be 80% or less of area median income, which is our maximum amount of income that a household can earn and still work with the land trust. And also that they are able to demonstrate a way of sustaining so that they can pay taxes, insurance, and the land trust lease fee moving forward. So we do all that evaluation up front, and if all looks as though it will work well, we move forward and work with them to repurchase their home through the county tax process. The other thing we've looked at in the last year or two is the last two items on the slide. We have begun to research pocket neighborhoods as the discussion around density continues to resonate within our community, is really trying to figure out if there are some different ways to think about density within the city of Minneapolis. So we have about 250 to 300 vacant lots throughout the city, and trying to think differently about how we may be able to use some of those lots instead of just all for single family homes, but maybe combining two lots to be able to do a 4 or 6 unit more pocket neighborhood design. So a smaller house footprint, some shared space, as well as maybe not each house having a garage, but some garages at the end and some green space and community space. The Commercial Community Land Trust is something that we have been part of a conversation with in a number of different scenarios within the area for about the last 2 years. And for the last year, we've taken on a more conventional or more approached look at whether or not the City of Lakes Community Land Trust should be someone that's engaging around community commercial land trust or starting a program, in particular in North Minneapolis, but looking throughout the city of Minneapolis. Number one, is it feasible to try to create some community-owned commercial space? And if so, is the land trust that model, or is there other models that maybe complement one another and the land trust has a role in that? So in the next month or so, we'll be wrapping up that study and deciding how we will proceed around the Commercial Community Land Trust. As far as lessons learned, this was interesting to just kind of take a moment and look back over the last 13 to 14 years. And I have been with the organization for 12 years. Our director has been here from the beginning. And so really just kind of taking a moment to think if we could do it differently or do it over again, what are some of the things we might think about in our approach? And one of the things that came up in the top of our conversation was the involvement of the municipality. So as we look at the opportunity for community land trust around the country, and maybe in new communities, is realizing that that support is critical. And if we could maybe do something a little different, even though we have tremendous support and have strong partnerships within the city of Minneapolis, when we were first kind of in the early development of the organization, in hindsight, knowing that it probably would have been beneficial and maybe we could have moved forward a bit sooner if we had had, say, a middle manager or a higher level person that was part of the board at the time. Understanding that most likely they'd transition off once the organization became operational, but really thinking about how do you get that municipal support very early on and at a level that can push the organization forward. The other is paid staff. I think there's a number of initiatives that are looking at volunteers and a number of committed individuals around the country that are really working diligently to bring community land trust and that option for housing and other type of ownership into their community. But I think moving forward, to be able to have a paid staff person is critical. To have someone who is focused, committed, and passionate. And that doesn't always have to be paid, but to really move forward the way a community may want a land trust to move forward, the paid staff is definitely a key piece. Even when this organization started, there was only 3 months of, I think, salary in the budget. So even if it's to get it started and to see what you can do, it could be a modest start, but to have that in place is critical. The other is to make sure that you really do have committed and passionate staff. I think that's with anything that people want to drive forward, that's a key element. One of the most important lessons we've learned is needing to be flexible and nimble. We've been able to apply this strategy of community land trust in a number of different community situations. And we've been able to do that because from board all the way down through staff, our organization, it works to be flexible, works to be nimble, and works to be responsive. It is much more difficult when you're not willing to stay in a box and really think about the fact that this may not fit into any of the ways you are used to doing work, but that there is a way of using this strategy to solve for an issue that's been brought to your doorstep. But that does require that adaptability within the organization. One of the other lessons we've learned is there's a lot of discussion and there's a lot of reasons, and they vary across the country, use of ground lease versus deed restriction. We have both, and in our condominiums, we have a deed restriction that's 30-year renewable, and then in our single-family homes, townhomes, duplexes, the ground lease is the tool that we use to secure the long-term agreement between the land trust and the homeowner. Wherever possible, our preference is ground lease, and that is just when you do have title to the land, when you have that deeper kind of connection to a property and a transaction, there's more teeth in the deal, and it does give you more leverage as things unfold, either with the household or with the property itself. We've just found in a number of different situations that the deed restriction doesn't quite give us as much oomph as the ground lease does in any number of scenarios that may arise over the time of property ownership or home ownership. The other that I really thought about the other day was the importance of relationships. It is through significant partnerships, whether it be with municipalities, other local governments, other community organizations, and even more so with our homeowners. Our greatest marketing tool is word of mouth. And we get asked all the time, how do we market and how do people find out about the City of Lakes Community Land Trust? And the word of mouth continues to be the strongest tool. And that is because of relationship with our homeowners, the fact that we want to retain that relationship post-purchase and do our best to do that and respect how people want us to be connected with them during their time of ownership. But it is through all the relationships and partnerships and genuine and sincere and wanting to do right by individuals and community that have allowed, I think, this organization to really move forward. The last couple pieces I'll comment on are the fact that we've also learned that we need to be part of the larger community conversations. So while we can focus on housing, and in particular we can focus on ownership, the fact that we are part of larger policy discussions, transit discussions, all of those pieces allow us to bring the strategy around community land trust forward and maybe challenge the way the conversation is happening. But it's much better to be at the table early on in those conversations, and we've learned that especially with the transit corridor discussions, to be helpful to begin to shape the conversations and hopefully shape policy as those different projects move forward. And within that, being able to really support the importance of land ownership, because if we can get out ahead of a lot of the development and the infrastructure going in place and actually create some land ownership, we have an opportunity to really ensure that the community benefits from these longer term, larger infrastructure projects. And to ensure that our message is consistent. So not wavering from the fact that long-term affordability, perpetual affordability, 99 years, all of those pieces continue to be woven into the conversation and the discussions around homeownership and what it means to create some community-controlled assets, and whether it be housing or whether it be commercial. And the last one I'll share is to ask, and I put an emphasis on that one because I think it's very important that we continue to ask very emphatically about what we need for our communities and what it's going to take to make that happen. If we continue to demonstrate or to act as if we can do this with $20,000 or $30,000 per unit, I don't think we will serve our communities well. And rather than settling for what's being offered to us is to really continue to push for the fact that this is what we need to create long-term affordability, and these are the benefits that it brings not only to individuals but communities. So really emphasizing the need that we can't be shy about what we need and want to make this happen. And so one of the key things we're asking ourselves as we've seen our market change dramatically and really seen where the city of Minneapolis is headed is whether or not we will look back at this time and see if we've lost an opportunity, because we still have a window to create affordability, and our hope is that we can capitalize on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stacey. That was great. So much good information there. I was rapidly taking notes, and I have my own list of questions, and folks are already sending in questions, which is great. And just so you know, folks, we will get to your questions after Tyler's presentation, but I am tracking them, and we will get to them, I promise. For those of you having audio difficulties, I've heard from a couple people. I do apologize for that. We are recording, and I will share the link with all attendees afterwards, so hopefully you can catch the pieces that went in and out. So with that, we will turn it over to Tyler.
Great. Thank you very much, Rebecca. It's really nice to be here with everybody this morning, afternoon. Really pleased to be representing the San Francisco Community Land Trust. I want to admit right away that I'm a newer director at SFCLT, at a newer land trust. SFCLT was founded in 2003, and we acquired our first building in 2006. And so we have, from that time, grown very rapidly, as we'll talk about. But I definitely want to defer and appreciate exactly what Rebecca just said. So much great information from Stacey, and there's so much more information out there that we won't be able to get to today, so I encourage folks to dig for it. Our original mission at the San Francisco Community Land Trust was really focused on home ownership. Our founders had a vision of sort of neighborhood-specific land trusts emerging, and this vehicle really being the tool for low-income residents in San Francisco to actually be able to own their home in this crazy market. And so our first project in 2006 eventually became and is currently a limited equity housing cooperative. We have a 21-unit building over in Chinatown with largely Chinese-speaking residents, and that is sort of our fully baked model there of a building that we were able to purchase, rehab, and then through a long process do some technical assistance and resource building so that the residents could actually invest and own their home. Since that time, we've really changed, and so the slide you see here now is our current model. And so largely because of the eviction affordability crisis that most folks are very familiar with, I should admit that I'm a reformed eviction defense attorney. A lot of us in San Francisco spent time sort of trying to keep people in their homes and have moved towards this land trust model because it is one of the only effective tools that we've had in this really just insane, out of touch with reality real estate market that we live in. I noticed on Stacey's earlier slide that there was not a line for San Francisco. I think it would have been well above the chart in terms of the values of property here just have no connection to reality. And so we've really tried to create a program that helps us preserve affordability in this crisis that San Francisco is facing. And so we use the land trust model to keep folks in their current home by purchasing the building mostly at market rate. We target buildings in the sort of small to mid-sized range. We have buildings as small as 3 units, and our largest gets up to 21 units, but we tend to target in the 5 to 20 unit building range, and especially, again, a focus where tenants are facing an immediate eviction and immediate displacement. Some folks who have read about the San Francisco crisis are familiar with the Ellis Act evictions, or the owner move-in evictions, or the buyout evictions, or the capital rehab evictions. There's just a lot of tools that landlords have, despite a very strong law on the books. There's lots of ways that landlords are able to remove their residents. And so when we see that going on, when advocates on the ground bring us those situations, our job is to come in and just buy that building at market rate, take it off the private market, and those tenants get to live in their home with permanent affordability. And then, of course, we've also created a unit that will exist in perpetuity after that tenant leaves. We do continue to do co-op buildings. So 5 of the 13 buildings that we currently own are have some flavor of cooperative living, all the way up to that, again, fully sort of baked limited equity housing cooperative. I have to say the much more popular model right now with our shared homes is the resident-owned nonprofit cooperative. And the major difference between that and the limited equity housing cooperative is that there isn't an ownership stake for the individuals. People aren't buying in a share to the nonprofit or the building. And so unlike our first project of 53 Columbus, where everybody put in $10,000 and now there can often be disputes around the management or ownership of that money, in our more recent co-ops, we see folks simply removing that element of ownership, having a nonprofit that the residents are a member of and that manages the home. And that seems to be much more consistent with sort of shared living, shared values. And I want to put a big caveat. You see the sometimes at the end of that sentence. We have these 5 wonderfully San Franciscan cooperative communities that we manage, and they do require a lot of love, and we try hard to give them that attention and love that they need. But the model has really shifted in San Francisco more towards traditional rentals. And so the more recent purchases that we've made, especially in the last couple of years with the city loan that we'll talk about, are much more traditional rental properties where hopefully the residents have an element of community and know each other, but we're not really building a cooperative movement in the way that some of our founders might want us to. And again, a lot of that's in response to so many people in San Francisco being displaced so quickly and aggressively. The city of San Francisco has its strategic solutions to the crisis. And so I did want to just touch on those briefly. We have an inclusionary law in San Francisco that requires new development to either build on site or to make a large contribution to a loan pool. And of course, most developers choose to make the commitment to the loan pool. And so the 2 big benefits that we see on the ground is the BMR rental and BMR ownership program. Total full disclosure, I am sitting in my fiance's BMR owner condo right now. It's a very small but lovely building that we were very lucky for her to get into. But it's very much a middle class, or what the city of San Francisco would call a middle class program. They also have a down payment assistance, so the DALT program, a second loan program, and other kinds of Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development financial assistance that, again, really frankly, is targeted at folks who really fit my profile, people who are white and are educated and fit that sort of 100% AMI, which in our community is really outstanding. And so we really, as advocates, felt like the tools that San Francisco was using were missing not only most of the displacement and eviction, but most of the low-income members of our community as they were getting evicted and displaced. And so I was not involved in the creation of this small sites acquisition policy, but this has really been a huge benefit to the San Francisco Community Land Trust and our community. And it really was designed and driven by both tenant advocates and affordable housing advocates who passed these 2 ballot measures, the Housing Trust Fund and Proposition C, over the last 3 or 4 years. And the result of that is that the city of San Francisco now offers in this small sites program a soft debt loan product. And without getting too wonky or getting into the numbers too much, what that basically means is that if our property that we buy with a city loan, it doesn't have a good year, it doesn't have positive cash flow, we don't have to send them a mortgage payment. And so that's obviously very different than the majority of loans that we acquire at the San Francisco Community Land Trust, where it's just like a traditional mortgage. We got to pay it every month or they're going to foreclose on us. And so the city of San Francisco really stepped up. And I do really want to emphasize the community element of this program, but this is now a department within the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development. It is run by 2 of the sharpest women in affordable housing in the Bay Area, and is being looked at by a lot of other communities and municipalities as a potential way to similarly fight displacement with a loan program that simply helps remove assets that are attractive to developers and speculators and just take them off the market. The city is so committed to this small sites program that the latest sort of development is the emergence of this Housing Accelerator Fund. And I wanted to share the website as well, sfhap.org. This is an independent nonprofit, and it is staffed by a really sharp lender. And this organization also has very generous loan products, and it's a little bit quicker, a little bit more nimble than the city. And so while the city, as folks can imagine, takes a little longer to issue a loan, when we're trying to buy a building off the San Francisco real estate market, we often have to move in 60 or 90 days. And so the city helped create this Housing Accelerator Fund just to help nonprofit sponsors like the Land Trust be able to move quicker and secure financing more rapidly so that we could get projects off of the market a little bit more quickly than when we're working with the city lenders. So that's been an exciting development. Of course, at this moment, both of those programs are subscribed, oversubscribed, I would say. And so while the San Francisco Community Land Trust was the first small site sponsor, there's now 5 small site sponsors in San Francisco. And many of our peers have eclipsed us in terms of the number of transactions that they are doing. And so, for instance, here in the Mission neighborhood in San Francisco, Mission Economic Development Association made 12 or 13 small sites purchases this year, and it's really starting to make an impact in that sort of local market, micro market, with this really unique loan product. So it is a fantastic program. We, again, want to really credit the creators and the city for administering it, and also want to be honest about the challenges and the way that the program is developing as well. While we call it a small sites program, there are limits to it. And so I heard Stacy mention a per unit limit earlier. Currently, the small sites program in San Francisco caps our loans at $425,000 a unit. Now, that may sound amazingly generous, and in most markets, that would be more than enough to acquire a building at market rate, rehab it, and keep the rent low. What we have found is that the program really only fits slightly bigger units, bigger buildings, so 7 to 25 units. And unfortunately, in San Francisco, the vast majority of eviction activity happens in buildings of 2 to 6 units. And so it's a great program. It is helping us sort of preserve affordability in the long term, but it isn't doing much, for the most part, around this more immediate goal of eviction defense and eviction prevention. And so the other element that we've run across is the Land Trust has done a couple of deals where we've been the happy ending at a lot of these really terrible eviction stories where you have landlords attempting for multiple years to evict their tenants. And at the end of that process, here comes the Land Trust, and we buy that building and keep those residents in their home at the low rent. What a fantastic outcome. Of course, one of the results of that is that we also just wrote a market rate check to some owners that are having a really negative impact in our community. And so there has been some discussion around, we have this very unique loan product. It is of a limited availability, and we are starting to talk a little about who do we want to be buying buildings from. There are lots of very well-intended mom and pop who have run their buildings for a long time. There are a lot of smaller landlords or even corporate landlords that have had more tenant-friendly operations than some of the folks who just are using property to maximize their profit. And so we've bought buildings from both groups, frankly, and we continue to look at potentials from both groups. And so, but it is an interesting part of sort of this great program is that the folks who profit the most, if you think of it in that sense, are folks that are actively evicting and displacing folks in San Francisco. And then, of course, there is the challenge of managing these assets. And it's been a fun part of my job to go talk to affordable housing providers around San Francisco as I've had this new job. And each one has said in a different way, you are absolutely crazy at the San Francisco Community Land Trust. All of these other providers have at times tried to do small sites or some element of cooperative living, and they will now say no building smaller than 100 units or 80 units is really worth it. And I totally appreciate and respect that perspective, and their work is so important, especially in San Francisco where we have so few affordable units. But I think this is part of what we love about the community land trust model, at least in San Francisco, is that it's allowed us to take on a challenge that a lot of other sort of day-to-day affordable housing providers or folks that are taking advantage of a LIHTC or a tax credit type program just don't see any opportunity and don't see a way to resource and fund these really small sites. There's the three factors that are really challenging: very high purchase price, a lot of rehabilitation that we typically need to do to bring the building up to code, and then very low rents that aren't able to contribute very much to those two things. And so the challenges in these projects on the physical side, and then of course on the resident management side, are really tough. And I think the Land Trust in the last couple of years has gone through some growing pains after taking advantage of this small sites program and going from 3 or 4 buildings to now 13 buildings. We did only purchase 1 building in 2017 as we took sort of a pause to get ready to expand as aggressively as possible, because we've started to run into some of those day-to-day management issues, non-payment of rent, hoarding and cluttering, bed bugs. And so while when we do our outreach and tenants hear about this fantastic tool of taking your building off the market, once that property is in our portfolio, we're very much, for a lot of our residents, just a landlord, for better or for worse. And so figuring out how to make that transition from sort of savior of the space to the long-term owner is something that we're definitely learning how to do and have a long way to go on. For those of you that have already penciled out pro formas and are trying to figure out a small site program for your locality, just a quick bit about how does this work. There are sort of limits to the loan program, and we aren't able to just go out there and buy every building we want. And so we have some of these rules that help us figure out whether a site is eligible. And what we've been able to do is meet with a lot of the tenants' rights and sort of community servicing agencies in town, and been able to train them on some of these rules so that as they're meeting tenants and hearing on the ground about buildings and sites that tenants are getting evicted or displaced from, that they can start to sort of run these evaluative criteria through a very basic sort of rubric and see if it's a good site to refer to the Land Trust. Our model is a very efficient model. We just added our 5th staff person this year, and those 5 staff people are trying to serve now 250-something residents at those 13 sites. And so we are aggressively contract property management, construction management. I'm a reformed attorney and try to save us a lot of money on those legal fees. But it is a challenge to operate such a quote unquote efficient model when you have significant physical issues come up, or building maintenance issues, or police activity, say, at a building. And so I think we're trying to figure out at the San Francisco community how to scale up in a way that keeps us efficient, but also allows us to take on this really heavy lift of being a landlord. And so a couple of the very basic assumptions that we look at when we're looking at a small site. Again, with the city cap at about $400,000, we add another mortgage on top of that, and usually can get about $500,000 per total unit. Much more than that, and we just can't quite make the financing pencil out. And as I said earlier, unfortunately, most of the sites that we're seeing now between 2 and 6 units, we run into exactly this problem. On an annual basis, the units tend to be very cheap to operate, at least for San Francisco, and with a $5,000 average for us. And the rates that we're getting from our lenders are, while helpful, not really fantastic. And so we are held to a very traditional 1.1 debt service coverage ratio, and we tend to, right now, are paying about 5.5, 6% on our debt at most of our new projects. And so this is one of the opportunities that I'll talk about in a minute in terms of our new work. And so while our goal at the Land Trust is to really preserve low and moderate income tenancies forever, one of the things that really makes that possible is that our buildings end up being very mixed income. And so you see a couple of different scenarios here, 3 different scenarios where a 10-unit building could sort of achieve, a roughly 70% area median income average with a different sort of profile of residents living in that building. And so many folks are aware of the impact that the tech community has had in San Francisco. We have a lot of new arrivals, a lot of these young white guys who look like me and talk like me and make a lot more money than me. They are actually part of what makes some of our buildings successful in the long run, because they enter in at such a high rent rate that's been recently set. Oftentimes we'll find in a smaller building, if we have $1,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a month rent, that can help us protect much lower rent in the building. And so it's a very, we think, wonderful thing that we're really capturing buildings as they are with the residents that are in the buildings, you know, whether they be mostly low and moderate income folks. But again, it's a interesting part of the work that some of our residents are more moderate and affluent and help us achieve this affordability blend over time. So I want to talk for just a minute about sort of the current challenges, and you can read a little bit about the sausage factory at 517 Castro Street. This is exactly the kind of building that the small sites program in San Francisco is not able to serve right now, and in fact would not even be eligible for that small sites program because there's only 2 residential units. And this is sort of a speculator's dream. It sits on Castro Street, on the main block of Castro Street, and it houses the Sausage Factory restaurant, which is both a historic sausage factory and, of course, sort of a tongue-in-cheek part of the branding of Castro Street there in our community. And so the middle unit in this building has been a Radical Fairy collective since 2004. And for folks that aren't familiar with the Radical Fairies, it's a very sort of back to nature, very aggressively communal group of gay men who are really about having an open door for folks to walk through. And so they reflect a lot of sort of land trust values. And so we've been working with that community to try to come up with a different financial model to be able to fund a building like the Sausage Factory. And so there's obviously an opportunity with a big restaurant in the ground floor space, but there's not much opportunity with the rents. You know, already they're at rates that are pretty unaffordable for the residents, even at the $2,800 and $3,100 amounts. And so what some of the residents have been working on is basically a Castro Community Land Trust. And this is one of our first site-specific private investment opportunities that the Land Trust is working on creating. And so we've been looking at a lot of the investors around town on the private side who have been able to make a lot of folks very rich investing in buildings that look a lot like the Sausage Factory. And so in a lot of ways, we're designing a private investment opportunity for a site like this that would allow us to finance it with friendly, low-interest investments from folks who care about preserving the LGBT community in the Castro. And by getting those lower interest rates and more generous investments, hopefully we'll be able to bridge what is still a very large gap for a project like the Sausage Factory. And so these new, I want to mention the People's Community Grocery in Oakland. A lot of nonprofits in the Bay Area are looking at sort of these crowd financing investment opportunities, and we are very seriously looking at that as well. For a community land trust, we feel like giving everyday San Franciscans an opportunity to invest $1,000 or $5,000 or $10,000 in affordable housing preservation and get a small return on that over time really is a type of financing that is consistent with our values anyway. And so the Sausage Factory, this is exactly the current challenge that we face, is how to sort of get these projects that don't fit this wonderful city loan program, but that are sort of at the heart of what San Francisco is all about and will absolutely be bought up by a speculator investor if we're not able to preserve it. So very, very quickly, I just wanted to mention a couple of the other tools that aren't on the slides here that we're also working on in addition to the small sites program. One is the tenant's opportunity to purchase. Some folks are familiar with Washington, D.C.'s tenants' right to purchase, and there's been some discussion in Berkeley and Oakland, and it's a really exciting movement. This is a law that would allow city-partnered nonprofits, and in some models, the city itself, to have a right of first refusal for any new sale for a multifamily apartment building. And so to give the land trust sort of an opportunity to buy any building before it would go out on the market would obviously sort of change the game for us and give us a chance to really create scale up what's currently a bit of a niche program into something more impactful. Just like Stacy, we're really looking at ADUs as a new tool for us. especially in those smaller buildings, to create new units and get more income and maybe make them financially feasible, but also because the city here has changed its attitude. For many years, it was very anti-ADU. Now, of course, San Francisco is very pro-ADU, and so we're finding a lot more opportunities to finance those. We're also looking to create a lot more accessible spaces when we're buying buildings, and so almost every ADU that we've created so far has been a 100% ADA accessible unit. It's one of the most challenging, difficult types of affordable housing that we found for tenants to find, and so we're really, as we're building new units, trying to make as many of those accessible as possible. I mentioned the site-specific private investment that we're working on. We're definitely trying to figure out what to do for our commercial and small business clients that are being evicted. Similarly, especially arts and artists are really having a hard time in San Francisco, and so there's a couple of small theater and live work type spaces that the city wants no part of financing, of course, and those are really challenging projects for us. We're similarly encouraging the city to take advantage of its rights under the tax forfeiture and foreclosure processes. Here in California, the city has broad rights to jump into the foreclosure and tax forfeiture process, and San Francisco chooses to do it almost not at all. And so we really are encouraging the city to take advantage of some of the tools it already has that it's not using. And then we do, I mentioned, have a lot of owners that would love to donate or work with the land trust to hand over their building rather than sell it to a speculator. Of course, they want a market rate. And so the most recent conversations we've been having with a lot of owners who are aging out is, what does a lifetime lease look like for you? And what might it look like to age in place in your building with perhaps a couple other units turned into small apartments? And so there's just not enough tools that we have in San Francisco. The small sites program is fantastic. And it's really been part of why we've been able to grow to this healthy portfolio of 13 buildings. But I think our team, especially in the current market, is excited about some of these emerging ideas and things that are really coming out of our community partners. Thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm excited to answer folks' questions here this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Tyler. That was great. And we are going to move into questions, and we do have quite a few. So what I'm going to do, Tyler and Stacy, is kind of bounce back and forth between the two of you. So I'm going to start with Stacy. We had a question about the Homebuyer Initiated Program, and if you could just touch on again how the land becomes a part of the land trust, how the land trust pays for it, what's that structure, how does that work in reality?
Sure, and this is specific to the Buyer Initiated Program, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So what happens with the Buyer Initiated Program is a buyer needs to complete their application process, which includes a pre-qualification for mortgage, and then the mortgage, and we've defined how much we have available to help someone purchase a home. So just for sake of example, we have $50,000 per buyer for affordability, and a buyer qualifies for $100,000. They can go out and look for the home and offer up to $150,000. At time of closing, essentially, it is a transaction between the current owner and the buyer. The land trust does not step into title and then sell to the land trust buyer. It's the sale goes directly between the two. But what happens at closing is the improvements and the land are severed, and the land trust takes title to the land at closing, and our buyer takes title to the improvements, and we bring the $50,000 or whatever we've determined to be our affordability investment to that transaction. When we do a purchase agreement, whether it be the Buyer Initiated Program or any other, excuse me, is the purchase agreement shows that market price. So if it's a $200,000 or $150,000 home, in the example I just gave, that purchase agreement price is going to show $150,000, and then we have an addendum we attach to purchase agreements that demonstrate how much the land trust is going to bring and how much in conventional financing the buyer is going to bring.
And as a follow-up question, since the land trust has title to the land, who's paying taxes on the land?
So in the state of Minnesota, we've not been successful in being able to legislate a differentiation for community land trust as far as tax structure. So currently our homeowners pay for both the land and the buildings. So it's all in one in the property taxes.
All right, thank you. And I will be coming back to you, but I'm going to shift over to Tyler. And now I just have to figure out which question I want to start with. Tyler, you touched on the small site program and how that works, but could you elaborate a little bit more on the funding sources for the land trust, how you're acquiring these buildings? Is it conventional financing in partnership with the small sites program, kind of how that's working?
Great question. Yeah, I'm gloss that over. We always pair a small sites loan with a conventional mortgage, and so we work with some of the CDFIs, Enterprise, Clearinghouse, and some of the regular banks, First Republic, Boston Private. Really, it's about who's been able to give us a first mortgage at a rate that has made that project possible. And so every land trust project involves those two basic mortgages: a very traditional first lender mortgage from a CDFI or a bank at, again, a 5 or 6% rate. That is absolutely hard debt that we pay every month. And we basically just tie the tenant rents, the very low tenant rents, to that monthly mortgage payment. And then the small sites program is really the gap filler. So small sites comes in to fill the rest of the gap for whatever's left for the purchase price, whatever's left for the rehabilitation work. We also have sometimes thrown in a third or fourth sources of finance. There are some nonprofits that have invested small amounts, and sometimes we've been able to put some equity into a project, but most of the time it is just a traditional first mortgage tied to the whatever rent level the rents can sustain, and then the small sites program comes in and fills the gap after that.
And you mentioned something about how if there's a rough year, you don't have to make a payment to the city for that small sites loan. Could you just go back over that? We had a question about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the rule is actually if our property does not have positive cash flow, that will come out. We do an annual report for every city-funded property. Of course, the administrative strings are significant with the city loan. So when we send off that annual monitoring report, if it shows positive cash flow, we actually split that positive cash flow with the city. They take 2/3, that's considered their mortgage payment, and then we take 1/3. But if at the end of that operating year, the property has not had positive cash flow, then we simply send that annual monitoring report to the city. It shows a negative or zero cash flow, and that's it for the city for that year. We say, see you next year, maybe. And so that really is what's amazing about the small sites program, is it gives us flexibility in the operation of the building.
No, yeah, that definitely gives you some flexibility. Shifting back to Stacy, could you go back over, you touched on this, but the ground lease versus the deed restrictions, kind of why City of Lakes prefers the ground lease, some examples, or maybe just one example where a ground lease has really worked better or had better outcomes than a deed restriction?
Sure. So I'm trying to think of a quick example. So with the so here's two examples. One is situations where we have had 11 foreclosures in the land trust at the City of Lakes. We have not lost a home to foreclosure in the fact that we've been able to buy them back and resell them to another land trust homeowner. In some of those situations, we were dealing with non-local banks and had ground leases. In one particular situation I can think of was a townhome, and had a ground lease on that particular townhome. Even with the resale restrictions going away, ownership of the land does not go away. And so it really shifted conversations, especially during the down market, with banks who thought that they could just arbitrarily sell the property to another buyer. And when they realized that we were in ownership of the land, it did really change the conversation to say, well, we just can't bypass you, because at the end of the day, you're still in ownership. And whether it's the lender or whether it's a future owner coming through and having to work with the land trust, we reserve the right to charge market rate for the land if it's a non-income qualified buyer. And so what we saw in a number of situations actually was where the response might have been a quick dismissal to who we are and that we had any kind of stake in who the bank sold the property to. When that realization of ownership through the ground lease and title came into play, they ended up working with us, versus a situation where we have a deed restriction. And I'm thinking of one situation where it was a condo and we had a 30-year deed restriction, and trying to work with the homeowners association with a particular situation that was going on with one homeowner, and kept coming back to, well, you guys have ownership of this unit. And while we had a covenant on the condo, there wasn't anything really tangible that we have ownership of that really allowed that same leverage of conversation that we had when we could demonstrate ownership of the land with the ground lease. And so for me personally, even, it was just this realization of, well, I can argue if I've got like physical, tangible something that we have title to. It's much different to argue covenant. And even though the covenant stands and we have, all sorts of documentation with city and county funding that hold us accountable, it was a much different conversation of just what could we really move on other than to try to find default within the covenant of the homeowner, which, quite frankly, while there was many issues with the association and with the lender in the situation, our homeowner had not defaulted with our organization. So we just didn't, it's hard to explain, but it was just this realization of not really just having as much weight behind us with the covenant as we've seen with the title to the land.
No, that's really helpful distinction, I think, for folks to be thinking about. Shifting back to Tyler, a couple questions from folks around, you mentioned, and you showed that table about how your buildings are becoming mixed income, to make the numbers work. So are the units intermixed, really low income units, low, not high, but closer to 80% AMI, are they intermixed? And then are you doing anything to kind of promote community within those buildings?
Two good questions. I should have said one of the things that the small sites program requires, that the city requires, is that the buildings that we buy achieve an 80% AMI average over time. Most of the properties that we acquire when we buy them are much, much lower than that, are like 30, 40, 50% of AMI. And so while some of the properties we've bought do have sort of the higher income units, what's been a little bit weird, frankly, is the city's requirement for vacant units all get pegged at a little bit higher income. And so you have suddenly a unit at 120% of income is what shows up when we get a vacancy. And folks scratch their heads and go, well, I thought the Land Trust was an affordable housing provider. Why are your rentals going out for 120% of area average income? And I certainly understand the argument, but because I guess what I see is the rents in the building are already so low that we end up setting a lot of the vacant units, or when we are able to rent a unit outside of the city's lottery, we choose to do it at a higher rate, because without that higher rate, we wouldn't be able to protect the already existing tenants. And in addition to having that the average 80% AMI requirement, of course, the city is also wants the residents to be very long-term tenants and targeted at families and folks with disabilities and seniors. And so it really is a program that sort of expects to, in some ways, protect those lower income units with higher rents. And again, it's the vacancies are one of the things that there's a lot of discussion around. The second part of the question, in terms of how do we build community, it's actually become the driving factor in our criteria for new properties. And so unfortunately, there are literally thousands of multifamily apartment buildings in San Francisco, and we get hundreds of inquiries every year, folks saying, please come and buy my building, Land Trust. And a high number of those meet the sort of basic financial criteria that we look at. But for us, for the San Francisco based nonprofit, A quarter of our board is folks who live in our buildings. A third of our board is folks who are members of our organization. And so we actually prioritize and almost demand that the residents in the buildings that we're acquiring are, to a large degree, very self-organized, and I hate to say it, but almost self-sufficient. Because we're not a supportive housing provider, we don't have services, we don't have counselors, we don't have social workers, we don't have the ability to sort of deal with a lot of the really challenging issues that a lot of San Francisco tenants have. And so it's made it hard for us, because those communities are what the Community Land Trust is all about. It's what we were founded on. The collaborative nature of our program is very important, but it means that it sets the bar very high to get into our portfolio. You don't just need to be at risk of eviction. You also need to know your neighbors and be willing to work with your neighbors and do an annual income certification and a lot of those things. And it's been interesting to see the response of various tenants who are at risk of eviction sort of pause or balk at some very sort of mild collaboration requirements. But for us, we can't manage a building that has lots of high need tenants. And so unfortunately, for better or for worse, we now use sort of the cohesiveness or ease of management of that building as a huge factor in whether or not we can take it on. Just as an example, we had one unit this year with a hoarder who turned into bed bugs. And that unit alone has taken up more than 20% of my entire staff's time this year. And so as we're buying new spaces now, I think we're sort of learning from the history of operations. And so we do have a whole half of our program that provides technical assistance, outreach, and support to residents in our buildings and the cooperatives. But we're trying to make sure that folks that are coming into the portfolio already have a high degree of that already. Not quite to the level of being a co-op, but you need to know your neighbors' names. You need to know a little bit about them. You need to be able to help them, you know, if something goes wrong, because that's kind of the nature of our collaborative community.
No, I think that's a good point. When you were talking and describing acquiring small sites, I was reminded just last week at our convening, we had a panel discussion about acquiring market rate properties and preserving them. You know, market rate properties that are serving affordable rent, like setting affordable rents. And that particular panel is focused on larger properties, but because of the other pieces of a market transaction, yeah, it has to feel like market rate housing, not supportive housing, for various reasons. Yeah. And that presents benefits and challenges. So, you know, I think that's helpful. So I have one more question for Stacy, and then a kind of a closing question for both of you. We got a lot of questions, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. I encourage folks to reach out to Stacy and Tyler. They did kindly share their contact information. So with your more specific questions, I would reach out to them if we didn't get to them. And I do apologize. I'm so glad for all the interest, and just wish we had longer to touch on everything. But Stacy, my question for you, one of the attendees was wondering, do you work with your state housing finance agency at all, or have thoughts on, you know, community land trust partnerships with HFAs?
Yes, we actually work very closely with Minnesota Housing, and they are our largest financial supporter. And the bulk of the funding that we have received historically from Minnesota Housing has been for our buyer initiated program. And so I think it goes back to building and relationship over time. And so they were very early on a supporter of the organization, and that has just continued to grow over the years as we've been able to demonstrate, you know, being able to deliver on what we've outlined in our proposals. So I strongly encourage reaching out to that. We have, in some cases, I would say maybe challenged the process at the state level, just because in particular the buyer initiated program does not fit into your usual development model. And so while it may seem kind of straightforward and great that buyers go out and find the house and it's a transaction with little risk seemingly to the land trust, it has often been a much heavier lift with municipalities and the usual funding streams, because it's not the standard development model. But I really encourage those conversations. We also have buyers who use the state finance down payment assistance loans. They've tapped into the home improvement loans. So there's a lot of intersections between our organization and the state finance, and they've been a tremendous partner over the years.
That's great to hear. Personally, I don't know, I shouldn't say personally, but as NHC, we're glad to hear you're good partners with the Minnesota HFA. We've done a lot of work with Mary Tingertall and Margaret Kaplan, and I'm glad to hear about more of the work that they do. So my last question is a little bit off of what we've touched on already today, but I'm just curious in case you do have responses. In your work with the land trusts, both City of Lakes and San Francisco, have you explored either existing manufactured home communities and those that are at risk, and or using manufactured modular kind of construction when you're doing new construction as a way to keep things affordable?
This is Stacy. So yes, to a certain level on both of those. We are looking, it's not necessarily a modular build, but a different approach to the envelope of the house. And so we're just in the middle of a pilot project that we've been working on with the city and an independent partner, as well as the University of Minnesota. So we've been looking at that. As far as more the manufactured homes, in our case, in the mobile homes locally, we have in a couple of situations been asked to consider potentially stepping in. Unfortunately, in particular, in one situation, the process had already kind of started down the line with a private developer, and so it was difficult for us to step in and be part of that solution. As far as for the whole park, one of the conversations was whether or not we would work with individuals and try to figure out how to transition into more conventional home ownership. And so while that particular piece did not work, it's an ongoing conversation in our area and whether or not the land trust can play a role in that. But we haven't been a key player in some of those situations, but continue to look for new technologies, new ways of doing things, and trying to create that affordability, especially as we've seen our market increase significantly. And that's on construction cost side as well.
I can say for the San Francisco Community Land Trust, we don't do any of all new construction. We do a lot of rehabilitation. In San Francisco, there is Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation is currently building one of its supportive affordable sites. And there's been a lot of discussion in San Francisco about using modular construction for housing for homeless and recently homeless folks, which is unfortunately a much bigger challenge in the community right now. And so one of the challenges many developers would talk about in San Francisco is it is not an efficiently operated building inspection department or fire department or Department of Disability or assessor's office. And so many of the innovative and neat modular type of spaces don't fit into the very crazy boxes that get created by the inspectors that we work with on our sites. And so many of our solutions are custom one-off because it's a 100-year-old Victorian that we have to build a 40-foot frame inside the middle of because that's San Francisco. So I guess a little bit more, the building code here is just a little bit harder to work with. And as they try to, in good intention, try to preserve sort of character of neighborhood, it makes it hard sometimes to do creative things like the modular construction.
No, I think that's a good point to kind of wrap us up, is that the community land trust model is so versatile and it can be used in many places. And the reason it works so well is because you can really structure it to fit your housing market, your current challenges. And just like you touched on, we can come up with some great solutions and federal strategies, but there are local pieces that have to be solved locally. And that's one reason the land trust model is so important, because it's not one size fits all for affordable housing by a long shot. So again, I apologize we couldn't get to everyone's questions. Please do reach out either to me or the speakers with things you didn't get answered. I want to thank Stacy and Tyler and Caitlin for joining us today. We very much appreciate your time and all the great information you shared. Just as a reminder, we will send all the materials to the attendees. And for those of you who are new to our Restoring Neighborhoods series of webinars, please consider joining. All you have to do is sign up for the email list and you'll get invited every month. The topics vary, but they are always about comprehensive community development, innovative affordable housing strategies. So we think you find them really valuable. And there's also weekly emails with some summaries of relevant content as well that might be useful for your work. So think about joining the task force if you are not a member. And with that, I will release you back into your day. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you.